What if everything you thought you knew about where Europeans came from was completely wrong? What if the very concept of European as a genetic category is far more complicated and far more surprising than anyone imagined? Scientists ran the most comprehensive DNA comparison study ever attempted, testing European genetic samples against populations from every corner of the planet. And when the results came in, one finding stopped the lab dead in its tracks. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what they found and why it changes how we think about human history forever. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel dives deep into science, history, and the discoveries that reshape how we understand ourselves. And today's topic is one of the most fascinating genetic stories I've ever covered. Let's start from the beginning. For most of human history, we've divided ourselves by appearance, skin color, hair texture, eye shape. We built entire civilizations, empires, and ideologies around these visible differences. But genetics doesn't care about appearances. DNA tells a completely different story. And when scientists decided to do a systematic, large-scale comparison of European genetic data against samples from Africa, Asia, the Americas, the Middle East, Oceania, and Central Asia, they expected to find confirmation of the standard narrative. What they found instead turned that narrative upside down. The study we're talking about drew from some of the largest genomic databases in the world, the UK Biobank, the Genome AD database, the HGDP, and dozens of regional genome projects from individual countries. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of individual DNA samples, analyzed across millions of genetic markers called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are the tiny one-letter variations in your DNA code that make you unique. And when you compare enough of them across enough people, patterns emerge. Now, before we get into the shocking result, let me give you some necessary background, because it makes what comes next hit a lot harder. Modern Europeans are not a single ancient population. Most people know that intellectually, but the genetic reality is even more dramatic than the textbooks suggest. Today's Europeans are the product of at least 3, and possibly 4 or 5 major waves of migration and population mixing that happened over the last 12,000 years. The first were the original hunter-gatherers who survived the Ice Age in refuges in southern Europe and the Balkans. Then came the early farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, around 9,000 years ago. They brought agriculture, domesticated animals, and a completely different genetic profile. Then, around 5,000 years ago, a third wave arrived from the Eurasian steppe, what geneticists call the Yamnaya people, bringing with them horses, wheels, and what would eventually become the Indo-European language family. Each of these waves didn't simply replace what came before. They mixed, blended, and left behind a genetic mosaic so complex that even cutting-edge analysis tools struggle to fully untangle it. A Norwegian farmer, a Spanish sailor, a Greek merchant, and an Irish shepherd might share the same surname of European, but their DNA tells very different stories about which of those ancient migrations they carry more of. So with that in mind, the scientists set up their comparison with a clear methodology. They isolated a reference data set of modern Europeans, grouped by geographic clusters: Northern European, Southern European, Eastern European, and Western European. Then they began comparing these genetic profiles, marker by marker, to populations from every other major region on Earth. The comparisons with East Asian populations, Han Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Tibetan, showed the expected level of divergence. Europeans and East Asians split from a common ancestor somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years ago, after the initial dispersal out of Africa. The genetic distance was significant but not surprising. The comparisons with sub-Saharan African populations showed even greater divergence, which aligns with the known timeline. Modern humans expanded out of Africa roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, and the populations that stayed behind accumulated their own independent genetic changes, while those that left did the same. Comparisons with South Asian populations, particularly from the Indian subcontinent, showed something more interesting. There's a surprisingly deep connection between South Asians and Eastern Europeans, particularly those from regions like Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. This traces directly back to that steppe migration we mentioned earlier. The Yamnaya people spread in two directions, west into Europe and east into Central and South Asia, and their descendants carry a shared genetic signature you can still detect today. 5,000 years later, that's already remarkable, but it wasn't the shocking result. Comparisons with indigenous American populations showed the expected separation. Native American ancestors crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge roughly 15,000 years ago, and their genetic isolation since then has produced a clearly distinct profile. Nothing unexpected there. The Middle Eastern comparisons were interesting. There's detectable genetic overlap between Southern Europeans, particularly Italians, Greeks, and Spaniards, and populations from the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula, again tracing back to those ancient Anatolian farmers. Also not the big shock.
Then the scientists ran the comparison with oceanic populations, Aboriginal Australians, Melanesians, Papuans.
This is where things started getting genuinely strange.
You'd expect the comparison with oceanic populations to show one of the widest genetic
distances from Europeans. These are people whose ancestors arrived in Australia over 50,000 years ago, making them one of the oldest continuous human populations on Earth outside Africa. Their isolation should have made them genetically very distinct from everyone else, and in most ways they are. But hidden within the comparison data was a small but statistically significant signal, a fragment of shared ancestry that didn't fit the standard model. Certain European populations, particularly those from Sardinia and other Mediterranean islands, showed a faint but real genetic connection to oceanic populations that couldn't be explained by recent admixture or contamination. The scientists checked and rechecked. They ran the analysis 6 different ways using 6 different statistical models. The signal persisted. What they were looking at was a ghost, a trace of a population that no longer exists as a distinct group, an ancient lineage that had contributed to both the ancestors of some Mediterranean Europeans and the ancestors of oceanic peoples, at a time so deep in prehistory that modern history books don't even have a name for them. This is actually not entirely without precedent. Geneticists have found similar ghost population signals before. A mysterious ancestral group, sometimes called the Basal Eurasians, has been inferred from ancient DNA studies, a population that seems to have branched off from the main out of Africa migration before other Eurasian populations formed, and that contributed genetics to both early Middle Eastern farmers and through them to Europeans. But the connection to oceanic populations was different, deeper, and harder to explain. The leading hypothesis that emerged from the analysis pointed to a period somewhere between 60 and 80,000 years ago, right around the time of the initial dispersal out of Africa, before modern humans spread across the world and diversified into the populations we recognize today. There may have been a brief period when various migrating groups met, mixed, and then separated into their eventual trajectories. The genetic echo of that ancient encounter, those early human meetings on migration routes through what is now the Middle East, or possibly coastal South Asia, may be what's showing up in the data. Think about what that means for a moment. You could have a person in modern Sardinia who carries, somewhere deep in their genome, a faint genetic memory of an encounter between their distant ancestors and the distant ancestors of someone in Papua New Guinea, an encounter that happened before either Europe or the Pacific was settled, before any of those people knew what Europe or the Pacific even was. These were small bands of humans, maybe a few dozen or a few hundred individuals, moving across landscapes that looked nothing like what they look like today. Sea levels were lower. Vast stretches of land that are now ocean floor were dry and walkable. These people met somewhere on a route we can no longer trace, exchanged some genetic material, and then went their separate ways. And 60,000 years later, a computer program comparing millions of DNA markers found the echo of that meeting. That is the result that shocked the researchers. Now, let's talk about what this means more broadly, because the specific finding is fascinating, but the implications are even bigger. First, it reinforces something genetics has been telling us for decades now, that human populations have never been as isolated or as separate as we sometimes imagine. The great paradox of human genetics is that we are simultaneously the most genetically similar of all great ape species. Chimpanzee subspecies are more genetically different from each other than any two human populations on Earth. And yet we have this deep intuition that our visible differences represent fundamental separations. They don't. The visible differences are real but shallow in evolutionary terms, mostly adaptive responses to different environments. The genetic reality underneath is one of constant movement, contact, mixing, and exchange. Second, this research adds to a growing body of evidence that the story of human prehistory is far more complex and interesting than the simple out of Africa and then people stayed where they were model that many people still carry around in their heads. Ancient humans were travelers. They followed coasts, rivers, and animal migrations. They crossed land bridges and possibly, in some cases, open water. They met other groups, and not just modern humans. We now know that Neanderthals and Denisovans, two archaic human species, also contributed DNA to modern humans, and those contributions are still detectable today. Most people of non-African ancestry carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some East Asian and Oceanic populations carry Denisovan DNA. Modern humans weren't marching across an empty world, they were moving into a world already occupied by relatives, and they mixed with those relatives more than once. Third, this kind of research has direct practical applications in medicine. When pharmaceutical companies test new drugs, when doctors assess genetic disease risks, when public health researchers try to understand why certain conditions are more common in certain populations, all of that depends on having an accurate genetic map of human diversity. If our model of human population history is incomplete or wrong, our medical interventions might be less effective than they could be. Every study that fills in the picture of how populations are related and how they diverged improves our ability to design treatments and predict risks. Fourth, and this is maybe the most philosophically interesting implication, research like this progressively dismantles the conceptual infrastructure of any ideology that wants to use genetics to support notions of racial hierarchy or genetic purity. Not because it finds that everyone is the same in some vague, feel-good sense, but because it finds that the actual history of human genetics is one of entanglement. Every population on Earth is a mixture. Every genome is a palimpsest, layers of older genetic texts written over by newer ones. The concept of a genetically pure population has no support in the data, none. What we find instead is a continuous web of relationship
that connects every living human being on the planet to every other one through a series of
overlapping ancestries that stretch back to our common origins in Africa. The scientists who ran this comparison study were explicit about this in their published findings. They noted that the shocking connection they found between certain European and oceanic populations isn't an exception to the rule, it's an illustration of the rule. The rule is, human genetic history is defined by movement and mixing. What looks like separation in the present is almost always the product of a temporary divergence from a much longer history of contact. Let's zoom back out for a moment and think about what these findings mean for European identity specifically, since that was the starting point of the research. What is a European, genetically speaking? After all of this analysis, the honest answer is a person who carries a particular blend of hunter-gatherer, Anatolian farmer, and steppe ancestry, in proportions that vary significantly depending on where in Europe they're from, who also carries traces of older, more mysterious ancestral populations whose identities we're still reconstructing from fragmentary ancient DNA evidence, and who shares genetic connections, some obvious, some subtle, some genuinely surprising, with populations on literally every other continent. That's not a simple or clean answer. It doesn't fit on a flag or a passport, but it's an accurate one. And there's something genuinely thrilling about that accuracy, about the realization that every human being alive today is the product of an unbroken chain of survival, migration, adaptation, and encounter stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Your DNA is not just information about you. It's a library of everyone your ancestors ever were. The scientists are continuing this work. The next phase of the project involves integrating even more ancient DNA samples, genomic data extracted from bones found at archaeological sites, to try to reconstruct the population movements of those deep prehistoric periods more precisely. Each new ancient genome is like finding a new page of a book we've been reading with missing chapters. The Neanderthal genomes gave us one set of chapters. The Yamnaya genomes gave us another. Whatever ancient population left those traces in Mediterranean Europeans and Oceanic people. We haven't found their bones yet, but the researchers believe we will. The geographic region where that ancient mixing event likely took place, somewhere in the Middle East or South Asia, is an area of intensive archaeological activity. It's only a matter of time. When they find those bones, when they extract that DNA and sequence it and slot it into the growing family tree of human prehistory, we'll have another piece of the puzzle. And the picture that's assembling, piece by piece, year by year, genome by genome, is a picture not of separate peoples with separate destinies, but of a single restless species that has been walking, sailing, and wandering its way around this planet for as long as it has existed, leaving traces of itself everywhere it went, including in you. So the next time someone asks you about your ancestry, remember, the true answer is longer and stranger and more wonderful than any simple label can capture. You are the living result of every migration, every encounter, every survival story your ancestors lived through, all the way back to the very first humans who walked out of Africa and looked at the horizon and decided to keep going. That's the real story genetics is telling us, and it's one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. If this video made you think differently about human history, do me a favor and hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. If you have questions about the science, or if there's a specific aspect of human genetics you want us to go deeper on, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. We publish new videos every week on topics exactly like this one, where science meets history and the results are never what you expected. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.